Hello, welcome to This Side of the Ceiling. I'm Kelsey.
And I'm Jill, and we're two good friends trying to live this life on this side of the ceiling as abundantly as Christ has called us to.
We are by no means experts, but we love to study His Word and share everything that He has revealed and taught us.
So come along with us as we open up the Scriptures and dive into His wonderful Word. Okay, we are in Hebrews 4 today, and we are going to be talking about a word that we can all connect with. I feel like that I've spent half of the first part of my life, for sure, avoiding this word, and the second half of my life just trying to get here, and that word is rest. You know, you think about as a child where you just don't want, the worst thing your mom can tell you is it's time to take a nap. Or I remember I had a strict bedtime at 7, and I just thought my mom was so mean, and especially in the summer when you had to go to bed before it got dark. And were you that way at all?
I don't remember specifically, but I do remember thinking, no, I don't want to lay down.
Yeah, I am someone who kind of struggles falling asleep. So, I remember being a little child laying there trying to go to sleep and then just, falling asleep. But we're going to be talking about rest today, but a different kind of rest. And, rest can have different definitions. It can be inactivity or sleep, but it can also be one of the definitions of rest is a mental and emotional calm. And it can also be the condition of something being settled or of the matter being resolved. We think of in the court case where the lawyer says, I rest my case, meaning it's finished, it's done, it's resolved. And really we're going to find that that's a little bit more where we're going today. So let's listen first to the first 11 verses of Hebrews and notice Hebrews chapter 4. Hear how many times you hear the word rest.
Hebrews 4. Therefore, since the promise of entering His rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the gospel preached to us, just as they did, but the message they heard was of no value to them, because those who heard it did not combine it with faith. Now we, who have believed, enter that rest, just as God has said, so I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet His work has been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere He has spoken about the seventh day in these words, and on the seventh day God rested from all His work. And again in the passage above He says, they shall never enter my rest. It still remains that some will enter that rest, and those who formerly had the gospel preached to them did not go in, because of their disobedience. Therefore God again set a certain day, calling it today, when a long time later He spoke through David, as was said before, today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for anyone who enters God's rest also rests from his own work, just as God did from His. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will fall by following their example of disobedience.
Okay, so we hear once again this author of Hebrews is telling us to look at the Israelites, that we are a lot like the Israelites, and we can learn a lot from the Israelites that wandered in the desert. And the Jewish people knew this story, and it's so easy to look backwards and say, oh, those silly people, why didn't they get it? And not realize that we ourselves can find ourselves in our life wandering around aimlessly. And I think this is what the author is saying. And so we see that we also have this promise of entering a rest, and that's good news. Verse 2 says, the good news came to us just like it came to them, but they didn't benefit from it because they weren't united by faith. And so we know that the word is alive, but without faith, it has no power. The Israelites didn't have the faith, and so because of that unbelief, they weren't able to enter the rest. And so we have this warning of, you have that same promise, you have that same good news, so put faith with it so you can enter that rest. Now, it gets confusing because you think, well, what rest is this talking about? When you talk about the Israelites, we know they were talking about Canaan. They were not allowed, at least the people that exited Egypt were not allowed to enter Canaan because of disobedience, and they didn't have the faith. And so they weren't allowed to rest from their wandering. They had to wander until all of that generation had died off. But it has to be more. There's more to it than that rest. Because if you notice in verse 8, it says, we know that the Israelites eventually got into Canaan. Verse 8 says, if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. We know that Joshua eventually leads the Israelites into Canaan. The walls fall down in Jericho. They subdue the enemy, and they make their homes in Canaan, in the promised land. But yet God is still saying there's this rest. For whoever has entered God's rest, verse 10 says, has also rested from his works. And so this seems to be a different kind of rest that wasn't finished when they landed in Canaan.
Not necessarily a physical rest, more of a soul resting.
Yeah, more of a soul resting. And I think that we have a little hint here that the author alludes us to. Is when he says, where it talks about God resting in the Bible. I think you read that somewhere in there. What verse was that?
It was in 3.
Yes.
The end of 3.
Okay, so where it talks about, and God rested on the seventh day. I think if we go back and think about the creation, and if you have a Bible with you, this is a kind of interesting thing to even look at. Sometimes we think of the creation story just as something we learn when we're little and all of that, but there's a poetic rhythm to it. And if you go back and look in Genesis 1, you see that God separates the waters and the heavens, and he says, and he sees it was good, and morning and evening, and it was the first day. And then he makes something else on day 2, and in morning and evening it was the second day. And then he makes separates the light and the heavens, and says he sees that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning the 4th day. And this rhythm goes on until you get to the 6th day. After the 6th day, when God makes man, God sees that it was good, and there was morning and there was evening, and it was the 6th day. But in chapter 2, it says, and on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. The rhythm stops there a little bit.
It does.
Yeah, it doesn't say that it was evening and it was morning and it was the 7th day. It just says it was the 7th day and God rested. And a lot of scholars believe that is a rest that hasn't ended. God is still rested. And that brings us that idea of, I rest my case. I feel good about this. I'm done. This is resolved. And so the beautiful thought here is that we have a God who wants rest for us. And not only a Sabbath rest, which is a beautiful thought in of itself, that he doesn't want us to just wear ourselves out working. But there's something deeper than a Sabbath rest. This rest that God rested from his work on the 7th day, and he invites us also into that rest. I think that's a really sweet thought, that we have a God who desires rest for us. Mm-hmm. There's a verse in Zechariah where it talks about how God sings over us while we're sleeping. My daughter works a night shift as a nurse, and the other day someone on the family text said, "Oh, don't forget to pray for this today," and she said, "I'll pray for it tonight. I love praying for y'all while you're sleeping." And so it's a sweet thought to think that everybody else is asleep, but I'm awake, so I'm praying over you, which is what God does. And but this rest is deeper than sleep, and it's deeper than Sabbath. It's a rest from the chaos that our world gets us caught up in. I think we've all felt that, even in a time coming out of a pandemic where we were all at home and had a lot of time on ourselves. Even with time, with
rest. Yeah,
it still was a restless feeling because we didn't know what was happening in the world and when were things going to get back.
Right.
So I think if you look, that's something that we as the people of God should have in our life, is a peace. There's a verse in Isaiah that talks about, a lot of times Jesus will say the world versus Christians, or the wicked, or the foolish. And so this verse in Isaiah 57:20 kind of it speaks to what we're talking about.
Isaiah 57:20, but the wicked are like the tossing sea, which cannot rest, whose waves cast up mire and mud. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked.
I mean, don't you know people in your life that you just think they just always have drama going on? They're never at rest.
Right. They thrive on that in some weird way.
Yeah, and then I think of peaceful places in my life. For me, I can think of my grandmother's house. I mean, my grandmother never got in a hurry, and it was just a peaceful place, and there was a peacefulness to her soul that didn't matter, that everything was going to be okay, and that idea of, for those of us as believers, we don't have to live in that tossing of whatever is the climate of the day or the flavor of the day, what is happening. We can have an anchor that our soul rests in. I think the scripture for us is that we don't have that tossing and turning like you read in Isaiah, but 2 Corinthians 5:21, a very familiar verse, says, "For our sake God made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." And I think that is the big point right here that the Hebrew writer is trying to say, that God is inviting us into a rest from works. He says it very specifically in verse 10, that we can rest from his works and enter God's rest. I think I spent a lot of my early life as a believer thinking that I just had to try really hard to be like Jesus, and that by doing things, and because I didn't want to mess up. And what I've learned over the years, that has been such a easier way to think of it, is that it's not so much about messing up as it is about missing out. That our works don't mean anything. It's like when you ask your child, your little toddler, to help you, fold the clothes. I mean, you're letting them help you, but you're going to refold them all after they go back. I mean, they think they're helping you. I feel like that's what God looks down on me, and he's like, "Well, good job, Jill. I'll fix that after you leave." Nice effort. But it's not that. It is a resting that God accepts me not because of anything I've done. He accepts me only because of Jesus' work on the cross. And that when he sees me, he sees Jesus on the cross. And, Jesus on the cross, again, said, "It's finished." Right. If you look at Jesus on the cross, he was restless. He was, some of the versions say he was thriving. I picture him, he was thirsty, he cries out for thirst, and he cries out, "Where is my God?" You see that tossing.
Physical unrest.
Yes, physically unrest, more so than Jesus ever was, because Jesus was calm when he was walking down with people. But he is experiencing that restlessness that the wicked experience, the people that don't know Jesus, so that we don't have to. Right. He experienced that on the cross, and then he says, "It's finished. It's resolved. It's done." And thankfully, when we have that Spirit of Christ inside of us, that's what God sees. That's his righteousness, not anything we do. I like a quote by Martin Luther. Someone asked Martin Luther one time what we contribute to our salvation. And Martin Luther said, "Sin and resistance. Nothing good." So I like that idea that it's not about what we do. And there are scriptures that people could say, "Well, but
Faith without works is dead."
Yeah, yes. What about that? Where does that come in? Because that is true, that love is action and faith without works. So, how would you answer that?
I think this is a deeper rest that allows us to enter